Fast forward several million years after the untimely extinction of the dinosaurs, the greatest lineage of reptiles the world has ever seen, and the world would have been an unrecognizable place. The plains and marshlands of the Mesozoic replaced with lush subtropical rainforests, teeming with little animals. Non-avian dinosaurs were nowhere to be seen. Gone were the huge tyrannosaurs, the spectacular ceratopsians, and the giant sauropods of the Cretaceous. This was a new era entirely, the Paleocene Epoch of the Cenozoic Era. The Paleocene lasted from 66 million years ago up until 56 million years ago, a relatively short segment on the overall timeline of evolution, but one in which animals, particularly mammals, managed to branch out into a diverse group of species unlike anything seen in the Mesozoic. This was a time that saw rapid warming after the effects of the KPG extinction started to fade into the past. Forests stretched across the entire world, even at the North and South Poles. These forests typically supported many more plants than they did animals, making them abundant sources of food and shelter for many new creatures that evolved in the aftermath of the Mesozoic. Land bridges still connected most of the continents in the northern hemisphere at this stage, and animals could freely move between them, resulting in different groups of familiar animals popping up around the globe. Taking a look at the world map during the Paleocene will show you just how familiar this world was starting to become. All of the major continents are visible in more or less their modern forms. Asia is perhaps a big exception, with the presence of the huge Tethys Sea cutting through what is now much of the Middle East. This resulted in large areas of mangrove swamp and tropical archipelagos, where life was free to blossom. Today, we will be taking a look at some of the animals that populated this new world in the absence of the dinosaurs. We will meet huge birds, bizarre aquatic creatures, and a whole host of mammals both familiar and strange. Join us as we travel back to the start of the Cenozoic Era to explore the life that flourished in the wake of the KPG extinction. I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Bespoke Post, for supporting the channel. Bespoke Post is a monthly subscription membership club delivering a box of awesome for you to enjoy, featuring amazing items from under-the-radar brands. 90% of the products come from small brands, many of which are based right in the US, meaning that every box of awesome has around $70 worth of goods inside, but costs you only a fraction of the value. Every month, they introduce their members to cool new products, including oysters, outdoor gear, barware, and more. It's free to join Bespoke Post, and you get the choice to decide which boxes you get sent. Each month, you get a preview of the upcoming delivery, and you can choose to stick with your original choice, swap to another, or just skip that delivery. The lineup of boxes changes every month, reflecting seasonal changes, which means that the current lineup includes the tinsel box to help make holiday decorating that bit easier, with your choice of 2 designer ornaments, a string of warm white fairy lights, and a set of 6 glitter star ornaments. There's also the Dulce box, a Mexican-inspired traditional hot chocolate setup that's perfect for a cozy night in. The box comes with a stunning Molinillo whisk, a chocolatera mug, 2 ceramic mugs, and 4 delicious chocolate discs from Oaxaca, Mexico. Bespoke Post also keeps the classic boxes in the lineup, including the ever-popular Weekender box, containing a durable carry-all made of capable canvas with a reinforced frame that'll protect your gear when you're on your travels. Depending on the results you get from a preference quiz that you take, you can then choose which box you want. So what are you waiting for? With Christmas just around the corner, you could get an amazing box of awesome with 20% off. Just click the link in the description and enter Dinosaur 20 at checkout, or go to bespokepost.com/dinosaur 20. Thank you to Bespoke Post for supporting the channel, and go check it out for yourself. While the animals of Europe would come to be known as some of the most diverse and well-known creatures of the entire Cenozoic, in the subsequent Eocene, their Paleocene representatives are not to be ignored. Some of the largest and most well-known animals of the Paleocene thrived in the forests of Europe after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. Perhaps the most well-known animal of the entire Paleocene lived here, and ironically, it was a dinosaur, a giant bird known as Gastornis. With a huge hatchet-like beak and a height of 2 meters, just taller than the average human adult, this was surely one of the most imposing creatures of the Paleocene forests. This was a large flightless bird, a member of an order that no longer exists, the Gasterosteoformes. First described in 1855, it immediately became a find of interest due to its immense size in comparison to the other birds it shared its forest home with. While they fluttered about in the canopies overhead, Gastornis was bound to the earth, wandering through the forests like a modern-day cassowary. Gastornis was superficially similar to the giant terror birds that would go on to become the apex predators of South America towards the end of the Cenozoic. The two groups were unrelated, but the basic body plan was there. This led scientists in the first instance to assume that Gastornis was the apex predator of its forest home, with many reconstructions showing it hunting early hoofed mammals. The debates have evolved as time has gone by, however, and studies on the leg bones of Gastornis show that it probably wasn't agile enough to keep up with the prey it supposedly hunted. Its beak also lacked the hook of the infamously carnivorous terror birds, and its claws did not seem adapted to delivering kicks. If it was a predator, it would have needed to be a stealthy ambusher, not a pursuit hunter. Even likelier is the fact that, like a modern cassowary, it sauntered through the forests consuming fruits and other vegetation, plucking its meals from the branches with its huge wedge-shaped beak. Gastornis was not the only bird in the forests of Paleocene Europe. Other birds came in much smaller packages, such as the little Fissuravis from the woodlands of Germany. This was a bird related to modern-day ratites, birds such as ostriches, cassowaries, and rheas, most of which are bulky birds that are entirely incapable of flight, with the exception of the tinamous, who can fly poorly. Fissuravis, however, was more than capable of taking to and remaining in the air. It was a lithornid, an animal from a group of birds that were known for their powerful flight muscles, which would have allowed them to perform acrobatic aerial displays over the skies of ancient Europe. In the absence of the pterosaurs, the main group of flying vertebrates from the Mesozoic, the birds were able to conquer the skies, and many lineages took up more advanced modes of flight as the Cenozoic progressed. If there is one thing the Paleocene is known for, however, it's the mammals. Mammals remained small throughout the Paleocene, but had begun to evolve into a number of extravagant and outlandish species, very much unlike the small beginnings they experienced in the Mesozoic. One of the most spectacular of these animals was the arboreal carnivore, known as Dormolocyon, an ancestor to modern carnivorans that lived at the boundary between the Paleocene and the Eocene epochs. It probably resembled a civet or fossa of the modern day, stalking small mammals and birds in the trees of its forest home as it balanced itself on branches with its long tail. Small mammals were abundant in these European forests, and many of the modern orders were represented. Paramus was an early relative of rodents, for example, that scurried through the undergrowth running from creatures very much like Dormolocyon, while multituberculates such as Bophius would have remained inconspicuous and nondescript, much like the voles and shrews of the modern day. Surprisingly, the Paleocene of Europe was particularly fruitful for its reptiles. Today, Europe is one of the most reptile-poor regions of the world thanks to its colder climate. But in the subtropical forests of the Paleocene, they thrived. Not only did they thrive, but many of them grew larger than any woodland mammal did. Take, for example, Champsosaurus, a genus of reptile that resembled modern-day gharials, which was capable of growing to a length of 3.5 meters long. With a flattened skull, fluke tail, and long snout, Champsosaurus would have made an effective aquatic ambush predator, laying in wait for either a large fish to swim by or a terrestrial animal taking a drink at the water's edge. With its powerful tail, it would have shot out of the water, snapping up the shocked victim before dragging it back into the lakes and rivers it relied upon for shelter. True crocodilians thrived in Paleocene Europe too. Diplocynodon is an example of this, a reptile closely related to modern-day alligators. It was bulkier and better equipped for terrestrial ambushes than Champsosaurus was, and may have reached a similar size in some circumstances. It would have preferred swampy freshwater lakes and marshes, where visibility for its prey was very limited. As we head out to sea, some of the most spectacular reptiles ever to exist could be found in the coastal and surface waters of Europe, the paleophids. These reptiles were true sea serpents, huge snakes that had given up a terrestrial lifestyle in favor for the abundant food sources of the high seas. The most well-known of these Paleocene snakes was a genus known as Paleophis, whose species ranged in size from 1 meter to a colossal 12 meters in length, making them one of the largest and longest animals of the entire Paleocene. Bear in mind that the world record for the longest extant snake was a reticulated python that reached a huge 9.5 meters. Some of these ancient snakes were true monsters that plucked birds from the sky and possibly wrangled with sharks in the ocean depths. Some of these sharks were no laughing matter themselves. Cretalamna, for example, a shark that patrolled the waters of Paleocene Europe, is thought to have been the ancestor to the largest sharks ever to live, including the infamous Otodus megalodon. Just like the modern day, Paleocene Asia was a diverse natural world of lush, green forests and diverse animal life. While today Asia is famous for its big cats, diverse primates, and colorful birds, the animals of the Paleocene that evolved in the wake of the dinosaurs were much different. The top predators of Paleocene Asia were the Mesonocids, carnivorous hoofed mammals that became widespread in the Paleocene and Eocene epochs. China is thought to have been the ancestral birthplace of this now archaic line of mammals, with creatures such as the small Yangtang lestes having sprung up just as the dinosaurs disappeared. Looking at them, you would never know their closest relatives were the likes of antelope, pigs, and cattle. They boasted large claws, long jaws, and teeth that could crush bone, perfect adaptations for a meat-eating lifestyle. Another genus, for example the larger Jiangxia, named after the province in which it was discovered, could easily be mistaken for a modern-day wolf, with its canid facial structure and long bushy tail. These mammals would have been a force to be reckoned with in these primitive forests, capable of making a quick meal out of many terrestrial vertebrates. Some of the more placid mammals of Paleocene Asia included animals such as Mimotana, early ancestor to the lagomorphs, rabbits, hares, and pikas. It would have in fact resembled a pika in life, a very stereotypically cute animal with beady eyes and rounded ears. Although this one was likely insectivorous, taking advantage of the teeming invertebrate species that thrived in the warm forests of ancient China. These forests were also home to a more unconventional predator, one that had not been seen since the age of the dinosaurs. For the first time in the Cenozoic, birds had climbed to the top of the food web. The best example is possibly Kinshan ornis, one of the very first birds of prey. Remarkably, one of the most noticeable features of this bird is the presence of a modified enlarged toe, similar to those found on the predatory dromaeosaur dinosaurs of the Cretaceous period. This digit would have been tipped with a long curved claw, used for slashing and cutting at its prey. While it was still relatively small, it would have been a formidable adversary in the forests of ancient China. A flurry of kicks would have sent most animals back the way they came. It is also thought that these birds would have made more capable flyers than their modern Seriema relatives, able to hunt both in the trees and on the ground. Amphibians and reptiles thrived in large numbers across Asia, with many groups of lizards establishing themselves in the perfect conditions. One of these lizards was a genus known as Ankylosaurus, which may or may not have been the earliest known example of a chameleon in the fossil record. Not all scientists agree that this is the case, as chameleons are thought to have first appeared much later in the Cenozoic. But there are striking resemblances between modern chameleons and the fossils of this animal. Staying within the realms of herpetology, but moving over to the amphibians in a stark contrast of lifestyles, we can see the first of the giant salamanders appearing at this time. Aviturus execratus was an ancestor to the modern-day Chinese and Japanese giant salamanders, but one that lived in what is now the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. At the time, Mongolia was a swampy forest, and such animals would have been commonplace. Aviturus is thought to have differed from modern giant salamanders in the way that it was happy both in and out of water. Its modern relatives are confined to streams and rivers. It was likely a formidable hunter of fish and small terrestrial vertebrates. Africa today is known for harboring the most spectacular terrestrial mammals on the face of planet Earth, and many of these lineages saw their early origins just after the dinosaurs died out in the tropical forests of the Paleocene. Mammals here were extremely diverse, just as they are today. Unsurprisingly, many of these animals were larger than those found in the forests elsewhere in the world, and many of the earliest ancestors to the proboscideans lived here, ancient ancestors of the elephants, the largest of all modern terrestrial mammals. Many of these early proboscideans would have resembled pigs much more closely than they resembled elephants. But the early makings of the iconic elephantine body plan were there. Bulky bodies, pillar-like legs, short rope-like tails, and long skulls were commonplace in animals such as Erytherium, an animal that inhabited what is now Morocco in northern Africa. It was an animal that had recently split off from the elephant's common ancestor with manatees and hyraxes. While the latter two either preferred coastal environments or grew much smaller in stature, Erytherium was a forest-dwelling browser, and one that would go on to produce some of the most iconic animals the world has ever seen. Erytherium's lineage progressed throughout the Paleocene, resulting in animals such as Phosphatherium evolving towards the end of the epoch. This was another Moroccan proboscidean with a much shorter snout and a long, straight body plan. All of these early proboscideans lacked trunks, but some of them may have begun to show the presence of tusks, teeth that slightly protruded past the upper lip. The bizarre and convoluted elephant skull structure was a long way off, though. Elsewhere in Morocco lived an animal known as Altiatlassius, a small arboreal lemur-like creature which may have been the earliest true primate. If its position in the primate tree is incorrect, then it was likely a Plesiadapiform, the group of animals that immediately preceded the modern-day primate group. It would have made a living hunting for insects in trees, very similar to modern-day tarsiers and lemurs. With a long, bushy tail and pointed ears, it would have slightly resembled a large squirrel, a far cry from the great apes and monkeys that swing through the trees in the modern day. Carnivores were present here too, and ones that would go on to create lineages of incredibly powerful hunters later in the Cenozoic. One of these carnivores was Lehemia, the very first hyenodon. While its ancestors would tear across the plains of the Oligocene epoch hunting large hoofed mammals, Lehemia was much smaller. It would have resembled a civet in real life, with a slender form perfect for hunting smaller animals in the undergrowth of the ancient African woodlands. In just a few million years, the hyenodons would become some of the deadliest mammalian apex predators the world has ever seen. Just as it is in the modern day, Paleocene Africa was a birdwatcher's wonderland. Many of the spectacular and strange lineages that Africa supports today had begun to appear in the Paleocene, one of which was a large unnamed genus of owl, similar in size to the modern-day eagle owls. It was the first one to be discovered in Africa from the Paleocene rocks of Egypt, and likely hunted in the same way modern eagle owls do, nocturnally in near total silence. The small mammals of the Paleocene forests would have had no idea the predator was upon them until it was too late. Out at sea and along the coastlines of Paleocene Africa lived a very different bird, Lithoptila, a relative of modern-day tropic birds. Modern tropic birds resemble smaller, more agile versions of gulls and are typically restricted to the air over tropical seas and oceans. With a long, piercing beak, Lithoptila would have lived a similar lifestyle, darting into the water after fish. It is unknown if it possessed the same streamer-like tails of its ancestors. Some ancient African birds were huge. Take Eremopesis, for example, a possible relative of modern-day ratites that lived in Paleocene Egypt. At roughly the same size as a modern cassowary, this giant would have stalked the woodlands and waterways, likely in search of small vertebrates or fruit. Africa was a massively diverse continent in the Paleocene, in the very same manner it is today. Today, Oceania boasts some of the strangest animal life, remaining the last stronghold of the bizarre monotremes, and home to more endemic species of wildlife than anywhere else on Earth. Just after the downfall of the non-avian dinosaurs, life here was as strange as it is today, with several new groups of animals popping up that were either new evolutionary experiments or relics of bygone Mesozoic lineages. Mammals are sparsely known from Paleocene Oceania, with monotremes and the occasional marsupial making up the majority of these strange animals. The most well-known of these is Obdurodon, an ancient monotreme similar in form and size to the modern-day platypus. With a duck-like bill and adapted flippers to swim through the water, it is likely that this animal laid eggs like a bird, just like modern platypuses do. These strange creatures would have foraged for invertebrates, both in the water column and by the side of the water, across the multiple pools and streams that permeated the early forests of Australia. Elsewhere in Oceania, strongholds of seabirds were beginning to crop up. Seabird colonies were particularly common in what is now New Zealand, where huge flocks of Australornis would have gathered to feed on small fish on the surface of the water. Australornis is a bird that does not belong to any extant order of birds, and is a key indicator that avians were amongst the most diverse groups of animals to exist throughout the Paleocene. While small, this bird would have been a powerful flyer, a keen consumer of fish that darted in huge shoals just off the rocky coasts where these birds built their nests. Australornis is thought to be a stem-anseriform, that is, a distant ancestor to modern-day ducks and geese, but it would have resembled neither closely. Along the very same beaches that Australornis hunted fish would have thrived a new and instantly recognizable group of birds, the penguins. The very first fossil penguins cropped up around 62 million years ago in New Zealand, and consisted of birds such as Waimanu manneringi, a penguin roughly the same size as the modern-day emperor penguin. While later species would grow much larger, this is still large by modern standards. Waimanu would not have resembled a modern-day penguin closely, although it was still a flightless seabird with an awkward gait on land and high agility in the water. Its wings would have been slightly longer and more pointed than its descendants, and its beak would have been highly adapted to spearfishing. It is thought to have looked more similar to a giant flightless loon or diver than it would have a modern penguin. Penguins were also present on the Chatham Islands in the form of a species known as kapupu, a bird of similar size to Waimanu that thrived hunting on fish in the water. While being a much more basal member of the penguin order, kapupu is thought to have resembled modern penguins much more closely than Waimanu. Of all the continents, Paleocene animals are best known and are most abundant in the fossil rocks of North America. Wyoming and Colorado harbor untold numbers of secrets, offering a very detailed glimpse into the lives of the early animals that thrived in the vast woodlands of this huge continent. America was a major stronghold to the pantodon, bizarre mammals unlike anything alive today. The majority of them were bulky herbivores, slightly similar in form to the giant ground sloths that would appear in the Americas much later in the Cenozoic, and some of them were amongst the largest terrestrial animals of the entire Paleocene. The largest and best known of these pantodonts was Berry lambda, one of the very first true large mammals to live on Earth. It was 2.5 meters long, about the size of a small horse, but mammals like this would pave the way for the giants of the later Cenozoic. Berry lambda was accompanied by Pantolambda and Titanoides, slightly smaller species but still some of the larger mammals of these early forests. Strange mammals were a Paleocene specialty, and the pantodonts weren't the only oddities in North America. Perhaps the weirdest of all Paleocene mammals was Psittacotherium, roughly the size of a large dog. With huge hypertrophied teeth and deep jaws, this animal's scientific name translates to parrot beast in English, and it's clear to see why upon looking at its strange maw. Despite the bizarre dentition, it was probably a herbivore. In the trees above darted animals such as Tilodus, tiny multituberculates who were beginning to thin in number following the age of the dinosaurs. With a prehensile tail and beady eyes, it would have resembled a modern-day squirrel. Meanwhile, chasing small creatures through the branches was Oceania, a small carnivore similar in size and shape to a pine marten or fossa. This was a creodont, a member of a dominant group of carnivores throughout the early Cenozoic. In the midst of the undergrowth darted animals such as Protungulatum, animals that were ancestral to the hoofed mammals of the modern day. While tiny, these little quadrupeds would go on to make up one of the most distinctive and well-known animal groups further throughout the Cenozoic. North America was also known for its diverse and strange birds in the aftermath of the KPG extinction, and one in particular stands out as one of the most famous animals of the Cenozoic. This was Presbyornis, a bird that looked very similar in form and size to a flamingo, but one that was more closely related to ducks and geese. With long, thin legs and a flat duck-like beak, Presbyornis would have waded through lakes and rivers on the outskirts of forests, sifting the water for small invertebrates to eat. It would have been readily capable of flight and was widespread and common throughout the Paleocene and Eocene. Up in the trees would have thrived a whole host of smaller, flying birds, one of which was Ogyptopteryx, the earliest known owl in the fossil record. It likely darted effortlessly through the trees at night after small arboreal mammals. Much of South America today can be considered extremely biodiverse, with staggering numbers of species across its rainforests, woodlands, mountain ranges, river systems, and grasslands. You might not be too surprised to learn that it was also spectacularly diverse throughout the Paleocene too, with groups of animals starting to crop up that could not be found anywhere else on Earth. Later in the Cenozoic, South America became the sole bastion of the nodoungulates, bizarre and often very large mammals that could not be found anywhere else on Earth. One of the very first of these nodoungulates was an animal known as Archaeogaia, only known from fragmentary remains of its molar teeth. It was probably about the same size as a small dog and strode across the land on lightweight legs, plucking plant matter from shrubs and bushes. Later, the ancestors of these animals would go on to become animals such as Toxodon, huge rhinoceros-like animals that thrived in herds on the vast grasslands of the Pleistocene. South America at this time was also home to animals that would precede the Australopithecines, small pig-like animals such as Tetragonostylops that would eventually become strange resemblances of tapirs and elephants. Tiny marsupials such as Cassia would have clambered through the South American treetops, whilst animals such as Rheostegotherium, early relatives of the armadillos, began to evolve thick shells and claws suited for life digging through leaf litter. Carnivorous sparassodonts such as Myulestes would have made an easy meal from such creatures, with their tough teeth and agile forms, capable of darting through trees after prey. The forests of Paleocene South America held more sinister secrets, however. Slithering through the undergrowth was Titanoboa, a gigantic species of boa that could have grown up to 15 meters in length. It would have been a constrictor and one of the top predators of the Paleocene, as it swallowed large prey items whole. To this day, it remains one of the most spectacular and iconic animals to have existed throughout the Cenozoic. Another large reptile that made its home in the Paleocene South American forests was Carbonemys, a species of huge turtle. With a crushing beak and 4 pillar-like legs, it would have been a formidable adversary to anything attempting to do it harm. The forests of the Paleocene were a stark contrast to the open plains of the Mesozoic. There's no doubt about that. Only a select few species managed to survive the extinction and carry on their lineages into the next era. And some animals that can be found in the Mesozoic rock deposits can also be found in the earliest Cenozoic ones. As the Cenozoic progressed, so did the early creatures we see here in this video. The forests eventually receded to give way to open grasslands and deserts, where larger, more powerful animals were able to thrive. Eventually, all of the modern lineages of mammals would rise, including the dogs and cats that make up the world's most infamous predators in the modern day. Birds would blossom into colorful and diverse forms, while the reptiles kept their apex predator status in some species of crocodile and lizard. The world was on the verge of changing forever, and it all started in these early Paleocene forests after the fall of the dinosaurs.